This video is for lesson 16-3, proving a quadrilateral is a rhombus. Learning goals are to develop criteria that we can use to show that a quadrilateral is a rhombus and then to use those criteria. So first, let's review what a rhombus is. Complete the following definition. A rhombus is a parallelogram with blank. And that is 4 congruent sides. A rhombus is a parallelogram with 4 congruent sides. Now let's create a theorem about a rhombus. If a parallelogram has 2 consecutive congruent sides, then it has blank congruent sides and it is a blank. This would be 4 congruent sides, and we would know that it is a rhombus. So this theorem gives us a criterion that we can use to determine if a parallelogram is a rhombus. What we would look for in the parallelogram is to check if it has 2 consecutive congruent sides. And if it does, then we know that all 4 sides must be congruent and it would be a rhombus. Here's another theorem. If a quadrilateral is equilateral, equilateral means equal sides. If all sides are equal, then it is a rhombus. So this gives us another criterion to tell if a 4-sided shape is a rhombus. Let's look at the sides. If they're all equal length, then we know it's a rhombus. Let's create another theorem about a rhombus. Here you have the drawing of a rhombus, and a segment is drawn from the top to the bottom and from this corner to this corner. These are called diagonals. These diagonals appear to cross at a 90-degree angle. They are perpendicular. So our theorem, if the diagonals of a parallelogram are, let's fill in the word perpendicular. Then the parallelogram is a rhombus. In an earlier section, we created the theorem that said the diagonals of a rhombus are perpendicular. So now we're using the converse of that theorem to determine if a shape is a rhombus. Number 6 is an example problem. Given quadrilateral BIRD with coordinates BIR and D, show that this is a parallelogram. So what we would do is graph these dots and check to see if it is a parallelogram. So I'm going to draw myself an X and Y axis. And then put some marks on here. Work from the center outward when you make the marks. Start at the center and work outward. That way it's a lot easier to make the space between the marks equal. And let's graph these dots. So -2, -3 is left 2, down 3. Here's this dot. This is point B. And then 1, 1. So over 1, up 1. This dot is point I. And then 6, 1. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to the right, up 1. Here's 6, 1. This is R. And then 3, -3. Right 3, down 3. Here is point D. Let's connect these together. And we have a 4-sided shape. What we would like to know is this a parallelogram? So to be a parallelogram, we have to know that the opposite sides are congruent, or it would be enough to use any of the theorems that we learned the other day to tell if it's a parallelogram. So we could look at opposite angles to see if those are congruent. We could look at the diagonals to see if they bisect each other. There are various things we could look at. Now, once we know that this is a parallelogram, then in question B, use one of our theorems from today to determine if this is a rhombus. So remember, we had a couple theorems we looked at today. One of them involved the sides. If all sides are equal in length, then it's a rhombus. Another theorem involved the diagonals. If the diagonals are perpendicular, then it's a rhombus. So we could pick whichever theorem we want to use, and if the theorem is satisfied, then we know this is a rhombus. Here's yet another theorem that gives us a way to tell if a parallelogram is a rhombus. Look at the drawing of this shape up here and then one of the diagonals shown. Notice that angle 3 looks congruent to angle 4. And over here, angle 1 looks congruent to angle 2. That means that that diagonal is an angle bisector of angle T and angle E. When a diagonal bisects the angles, then the shape must be a rhombus. So if a diagonal bisects the angles in a parallelogram, then the parallelogram is a rhombus. Here's a check your understanding question, so I'll pause the video. Okay, now the answer to number 10. Can a rectangle ever be classified as a rhombus as well? Let's think about what that might look like. To be a rectangle, there must be 4 90-degree angles. And to be a rhombus, there must be 4 equal sides. So as long as it's possible to draw a shape that has 4 90-degree corners and has the 4 equal sides, then a rectangle would be a rhombus. So the answer is yes, and that would be when our shape is a square. So if we have a square, then that is a rectangle and it is a rhombus. So in this lesson, we looked at the shape called rhombus and created some theorems as ways to tell if four-sided shapes are rhombuses.